Hey everyone, so I have Belinda Fettke on with me today. Some of you may know her as Gary Fecky's wife, and I'm so happy to have her on the podcast. I've been listening to, your research and all about Dr. Fecky's story now for years, and I find it just absolutely fascinating. I think I'm even more fascinated by the fact that this isn't completely out there in every household, that not everybody knows about this. So I really want to get your message out. I was hoping you could start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this state of being a researcher on dietary guidelines.
Well, Scott, that's a very interesting question. And I had no idea I was ever going to become a researcher on dietary guidelines. I will just say I started out as a nurse, so I have a health background. I watched Gary go through his own health journey. In 2000, he was diagnosed with a very aggressive pituitary tumor, which required surgery. And so as my research has gone on and on, we've looked back to our diets. We've looked back to what we were eating. And as Gary says, we both learned in our medical training to eat by the dietary guidelines. And he was very sick. We were also eating polyunsaturated seed oils and cooking with them and using margarine. Gary was a light milk boy. I never changed to light milk. I couldn't stand it. But he was following all the rules, doing all the things he thought was right. And he was a very, very sick boy for a few years there. He was having, so after his surgery, because the tumor was found quite late, so he required surgery, chemo and radiotherapy, and we don't question that because he improved from those things initially. But after nearly 4 years of chemotherapy, he required more surgery. And then in 2011, he was told there was pretty much not much more they could do to control this tumor, and he was at risk of losing his eyesight. So he just went, well, I'm going to do what a lot of other people do, and I'm going to go to Dr. Google because this isn't good enough. At the time, he was told, eat by the dietary guidelines. At the same time, also, our pharmacist was a very holistic person, and she said, Gary, I've been looking into a drug called metformin, which they're using for people with diabetes, and they're seeing an unusual side effect of this drug, metformin, that people are getting either less incidence of cancer or their cancer is actually improving. They require less medication, and sometimes it's even going into remission. All of these things were lining up. He got in touch with Dominic D'Agostino and Colin Champ in America and the role of sugar in cancer management. And it just started to all click. He went back to his basic biochemistry, went back to basic physiology. Because I think the amazing thing is, as a medical student, you are taught all of those things in the first 2 years: anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. And then the next 3 to 4 years of your medical training is about siloing, medicating and band-aiding sick care with surgery. You just go, wow, they teach you so much. You have to know all the pathways of medications and this. You just learn about sickness, and you forget at the beginning, maybe health was what you ate. You just lose it. And Gary went back to it and went, this just makes sense. The mitochondria are the fuel sources, the engines of the cells, and they need fuel. And this fuel can come from essential proteins, essential fatty acids. We need essential vitamins and minerals, but we don't need carbohydrates in our diet. He had completely forgotten. He had no idea. And also not just sugar, but as soon as you eat a starchy carbohydrate, it turns to glucose the minute you ingest it. And we learned that back at school. We ate Sayo biscuits and measured the glucose. So it's fascinating how it changes so much. And I think you have so much responsibility as a doctor to make sure you're medicating people safely and you're operating. He's an orthopedic surgeon, that you truly forget because your education takes you on a different pathway. So he went back to the basics and found joy in medicine. Not only did he improve his own health by getting rid of sugar, and he was very strong. He just went, I don't need this anymore. Bang, it's gone. I took a little bit longer. But he looked at the carbohydrates and lowering those. And he saw for his patients who had diabetic foot complications, that they were going into remission, that was slowing down. And a couple of his very early diabetic foot ulcers actually healed. So joy in medicine, isn't that what you go into medicine for, to make people better? And he went to the dietetic department at the hospital, and he just said, oh my gosh, we're doing this wrong. And he wanted to work with them. He was so excited. And he wanted to talk about how the diabetic menu in the hospital at that time included 3 desserts per day. So not only was high carb, sugary breakfast cereals and breads and like a lot of junk in that diet, but 3 desserts for people who've already in there with diabetic foot complications. So he was amputating, I think by 2016, amputating a part of a toe or forefoot, foot, or even a lower leg every single week in northern Tasmania in his clinic. And these people are devastated. He said it's just horrible to maim someone when you start to realize that this could be a lifestyle disease that could go into remission or even be prevented completely simply by what we eat. The dietetic department were not interested. He was stunned. He was flabbergasted. He just went, this makes no sense. I'm telling them I want to work with them. I want to do studies. I want to look at these things. His patients, where their blood glucose was out of control in hospital. And even if they had good control at home, they often got worse when they came to hospital. So I wouldn't say he got angry, but he got more determined to keep looking into this and start to challenge. He looked into the hospital menus and he started speaking publicly about it. He went to the newspapers, he went to politicians, he went to different people when nobody at the hospital would listen. He got reported by a dietitian to the medical board for recommending a patient in hospital reduce their sugar. Who does that? And we thought, the medical board are going to go, yeah, this is ridiculous. This is a power play. Who knows what this is? This makes no sense. Of course, people should be reducing sugar. So he thought the medical board are going to throw this out. But they didn't. They investigated him for 2.5 years, Scott. 2.5 years. And in Australia, unlike Tim Noakes, who you also are probably very aware of in South Africa, he also got reported for talking about sugar and low carbohydrate at exactly the same time, pretty much. And I've got a photo of the CEO of the Dietitians Association of Australia with Claire Jewelstring Strider, who reported Tim Noakes, a photo of the two of them, very pally. So that's also an interesting coincidence, I believe. But Tim's was an open court. It was a public court. Gary wasn't even allowed to have a lawyer. He had to answer questions to the medical board for 2.5 years that they were threatening to take his medical license away. And we're just going, oh my gosh, he provided a thesis of information to them over that time going, but look at the harms of sugar, look at the harms of sugar, look at the harms of carbohydrates. I watched Gary and others who had started low carb down under here, a range of people, but certainly mostly doctors, but some dietitians and some nutritionists, just talking about how important this movement was. And when I say low carb, certainly Gary was really a big believer in this reducing carbohydrate therapeutic restriction. But he also believed in including animal proteins and fats in the diet because they provide the healing and the tissue growth. And for him, looking after people whose feet were ulcerating, he believed that they needed that protein to also improve. But we didn't think he'd be in trouble for talking about that. So he really was focusing on it's the carb and it's the sugar because we have a very big wheat industry. We have a very big sugar industry here in Australia. I'm sure Pharma was in there at the background somewhere, murkily hiding away too. But these were the groups that we probably thought are targeting low carb advocates. The medical board here brought on an expert witness to determine if Gary could talk about reducing sugar. And he was the Emeritus Professor of the Southeast Asia Pacific region in nutrition. He was a doctor, but he'd been on the board of the Dietitians Association. He was writing the textbooks for dietetics. Like, this is a big gun to bring in to determine if an orthopedic surgeon in a tiny, tiny town in Tasmania could talk about this. So when this came about, I just started thinking, my husband's done everything right. He's improved his own health, and amazingly, he has improved the health of his patients. He was running volunteer, groups. He was educating at every level he could possibly educate. And he just started getting onto Facebook and providing information. So a lot of the work he was doing was absolutely free to the community. He just wanted to do good. That was his passion. So when this all happened and they wouldn't stop, I went, I've got to defend him. I've got to work this out as well. So I started looking into things. And the first thing I wanted to look at was, who is this expert witness? Did a deep dive and was not surprised, a little bit, but not surprised to find he worked for the cereal industry. So as I say, when cereal for brekkie, which was the tagline of a group of cereal industries, it was Nestle, Kellogg's, Sanitarium, and a group called Freedom Foods here in Australia. The board members were meeting with representatives from these food industries, cereal industries, once every 3 months. And they were determining, all their marketing practices and who was this and who was that. And I uncovered documents where they actually named Gary and Low Carb Down Under, but Gary was the only medical doctor actually named as targeted for active defense, whatever that means. But I reckon it's being reported to the medical board. So this group was colluding with the Dietitians Association of Australia. They were paying, as a corporate partnership, Cereal for Brekkie were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia $23,000 a year to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal, grains, and even sugars messaging. We checked with some dietitians. They had no idea their parent body, which not only accredits them and educates them, but determines who's going to be allowed to actually practice. This is their body that covers everything, totally unregulated, independent. They were using their members. And these members were getting the information about cereal for brekkie and how wonderful it was. And don't listen to anybody, because cereal is so important, because it's fortified, it's this, you've got supplements. You have to have sugar, because cereal on its own is a very bland diet. And if sugar helps to make a healthy, low-fat, bland diet better, a little bit of sugar is okay. It was unbelievable. They came after Gary. He was working, this expert witness was working for Sanitarium, one of the cereal companies. And in the back of my mind, because I grew up in Sydney, we're now in Tassie, but I grew up in Sydney, very vaguely aware that Sanitarium was owned by the Seventh Day Adventist Church. Then Sanitarium tells us they are the health and wellbeing company. So the health and wellbeing company provide medical education. They provide fact sheets for doctors. A friend told me, Belinda, you won't believe it, until I heard you start to speak, I hadn't thought that on every computer in a doctor's practice, and there's two softwares, Medical Director and Best Practice, all we have to do is hit a button and Sanitarium's fact sheets get printed out for our patients. For diabetes, for obesity, for gestational diabetes, for gut irritation, everything. And when I looked at some of these fact sheets, some of them even stated eat Weet-Bix, their own brand, but nearly all of them, don't eat meat, don't eat dairy. I was going, wow, this is just unbelievable. I started to look at the other things that Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing did. They started Australasian Nutrition Advisory Council back in 2000. And of course, this expert witness, Mark Walquist, was the chair of it. So he'd been with Sanitarium for at least, because that's as far as I could go back on the Wayback Machine, which is an internet archive. It's a fantastic resource. It's something I've used a lot. He was working with Sanitarium from the year 2000. So I provided this information to the medical board. I said, I think this is really wrong. You're being compromised by a man who has worked for a cereal industry, not just that, but a cereal industry owned by a church who appears to be demonizing animal proteins and fats and promoting carbohydrates as the thing. Some of the things the Australian Nutrition Advisory Council had done was to actually publish a report on red meat causes cancer. And then that was adopted by all of the associations here, the Kidney Council, the Heart Association, Cancer Council, all of these things from this Australasian Nutrition Advisory Council, which at the bottom had Copyright Sanitarium. Again, nobody's looking at these things. Or maybe some people do and they just don't even think, which is probably what we'd been doing for a very long time. So I'm not anti-vegan, anti-vegetarian, or anti-religion. I'm pro-choice. But the more I've done research into this space, Scott, is the more I've realized that this choice is being taken away from you and I, from people who have found that reducing sugar and carbohydrates in their diet improves their health outcomes, and from people who choose to include animal proteins and fats in their diet. And as I say, when the cereal from Brekkie came after my husband, the mama bear came out. And I have spent the last 8 years doing a deep dive and I've not stopped. I try to be respectful with the information because I truly believe that a lot of people who are advocating this, like there's the bad farmer and there's the bad food industry. But even those people, some of the people who invented the things in the first place never set out to do bad. Do you know what I mean? They thought, I think it's man's brilliance. I can invent this. I can take the place of this. I can do this. Or groups of people have worked together. And even through this religious influence, shaping dietary guidelines, the people who are doing it believe it to be the right thing. So I try to be respectful, but I can't stay quiet.
It's incredible. There's so many things that you said there that are, I would say, go down as my biggest pet peeves in life. And in terms of being exposed to this whole world, and there's so many webs in that closet. It's almost hard to even know where to start. So where do you think all these sort of corruptions in terms of nutrition science and our beliefs and demonization of red meat and just meat in general, where do you think that this all started? Where are the origins of this?
Sylvester Graham, which you may or may not have heard of, being from Canada, might not be, but in America, certainly people have heard of graham crackers. He was about 1830 and he was a very big believer in temperance health reform, which is what they started to be called, temperance health reformers. And they believed in the concept of, I guess, good sleep and different things, but taking animal proteins more than animal fats, but animal proteins out of the diet because they believed that it would harm people and it was causing a lot of issues at the time. Sylvester Graham, actually, he didn't invent the crackers. His followers invented the crackers, but he was very strict about a whole lot of things. He started, because it was around the cholera time, he wanted to push for not drinking the water. He wanted to push for people washing more frequently. He believed in sleeping on hard mats and everything else, but he believed masturbation was probably the cause of a lot of downfall. Vitality, which is, again, hinting on a little bit of the Eastern mysticism of the vitality. The more you use, more energy you use, the less energy you have in your supply tank. And he believed sex and masturbation used a lot of energy and were a waste of energy because you needed that to actually just live and survive. So he said you shouldn't have sex more than once a month and you should never masturbate it. Like it was vile and defiled people. So moving on from that, then you had Caleb Jackson and some other health reformers. There was Larkin and Coles and different other groups of people, but Caleb Jackson started the Danville retreat, and definitely the Seventh Day Adventist Church founders went to Caleb Jackson's. He'd invented a granola, and he believed in sunlight and hydrotherapy and all sorts of things, but he was very, very anti-meat. So then the next group to come along was the Seventh Day Adventist Church. And the founders of the Seventh Day Adventist Church included a guy called Joseph Bates, Ellen G. White, and her husband, James White. But Ellen G. White brought it into the doctrines of the church. And she states that she was told that meat or flesh meat was a toxic stimulant, as harmful, if not worse, than alcohol, tobacco, spices, all sorts of things. She was told that meat defiled morally, physically, and spiritually. She was told that meat caused masturbation. It animalized the nature. It stirred baser passions. It did all those things. And masturbation, she taught, defiled people morally, spiritually, and physically. It was a very potent message that she created. And she also taught that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, as part of this remnant church, their duty was public health education. Medical evangelism was the right arm of the church. And as they developed this health reform message, it was to become an entering wedge to the church. So this is taking a church in a different way. And I'll say something and then I'll come back again. But throughout my research and my readings, I've discovered that this entering wedge, they write about it for places like China and different third world countries that they can't generally get into with their Bibles and as part of a Christian religious group, but they can go in with health. They can go in and offer to set up hospitals. They can go in and offer to set up clinics and to provide people with information on how to cook food and do all of these other things. That's their entering wedge. And once they get in, as she said, that this medical evangelism will offer opportunities to open hearts and minds to, well, she says to the gospel, but I would say it's their version of the gospel. It's a fascinating way to do it. And it's almost like stealth when you read more and more about all the different ways. You know, they say, let's open restaurants, let's open coffee shops. Oh, not coffee shops, obviously. Sorry. Let's open restaurants and places where people can come and gather. And then we'll have information out there. Always, you know, when you go to a doctor, you know, bring it into people. There's a group called the Adventist Medical Evangelistic Network. And these are just health professionals who belong to this group to work out ways that they can evangelize to their patients. It's a big group and it's very fascinating how they're into this space. And I'll talk more towards the end, we've still got time, talk more about how this Adventist health reform message is literally sweeping across America. So this is their mission. And I think when you look at all the financial incentives for people to get us to eat a plant-based diet, and that's huge, and we may not have time to go into all of that today. This idea of the financial incentives with food industry and pharmaceutical industry is massive. But when you consider a religious belief is a purpose and it's about salvation, it's even bigger. They're not after financial things. And it's also much harder to have a discussion with people that this might not be the right messaging. This influence is becoming so huge. As I said, it was in our medical fact sheets that our GPs are being given. But their belief, they train people to be doctors, professors, educators. This is their thing to do. This is so important to them. I don't know if you've seen the size of Loma Linda University Hospital. It is massive. And just when you think how far it's gone beyond that. In America at this moment, because now that you've moved there, you might want to be aware that I believe the Adventist health reform message is sweeping across America and literally embedding itself in the very fabric of society. And I say that because I've been studying a group called the American College of Lifestyle Medicine for years, and understanding that they were founded on the Loma Linda University campus in 2003 as the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine. They didn't become the American College of Lifestyle Medicine until 2004. And every single one of the founding members were devout Seventh-day Adventists. By the time it became the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, they were either Adventists or adherents of a plant-based diet. and the advisory people coming from Canada. You may have heard of David Jenkins. He's a very, very big industry man who pushes a plant-based diet. And so he was on the advisory board, as was Walter Willett, who from Harvard University. Moving forward, this group has grown and grown, and it's now global. They've got different lifestyle medicine groups all around the world. They created the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine. They've created the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine, and the names just go on and on. But the point is that they are not only getting into medical education at least 8 universities in America. So far, they've been accredited and allowed to teach their, I would say, plant-based diet. They're teaching people to write prescriptions, doctors, health professionals, to write prescriptions to move more, which is the Coca-Cola influence. So some people from Coca-Cola moved in 2009, 2010 onto their board. So move more, eat less meat. And this is being taught. Not only that, it's being accepted by the White House Conference on Hunger, Health and Nutrition. The Biden administration have just endorsed this messaging because they've allowed the American College of Lifestyle Medicine to, or when I say allowed, they've accepted their offer to offer 100,000 doctors in the US 5.5 hours of continuing medical education. And they're saying it's worth $24.1 million. We're gifting this to the White House Conference. We want to make a difference to the health of everybody. But these resources, maybe not the 5.5 hour one, because I had a look at it and it seems to be a much more gentle introduction into lifestyle medicine. But their educational resources and their exams, you have to believe that animal proteins and fats are bad. If you look at their research articles, if you look at the people who've been presidents of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, not necessarily this one, but many of the presidents have been devout Seventh Day Adventists and still board members, exam writers, and everything else. So the challenge to me is if the Biden administration have just allowed them to educate 100,000 people, okay, 5.5 hours, it's not worth 24, or it might be worth 24 million if they paid for it. But to gift it, it's not going to cost the American College of Lifestyle Medicine a cent because these resources are already packaged up. They're sitting on their website. They just have to release them. It doesn't cost them anything. But imagine if those 100,000 people say, oh, that was an interesting resource, because that 5.5 hours probably is a bit of an interesting resource. And look how much more they've got. It's a very slick website. I think I'll sign up for another one. Maybe I'll tell my friend, you should sign up for this. Quite interesting. Oh, and then I'll sit the exams, which is anywhere between $899 and $1,700 per person. I think I might do that too. How much is the windfall of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which is already taking the Adventist health reform message global? They are going to make a windfall of potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. Not only that, that was their first offer. The second offer is the American College of Lifestyle Medicine under the umbrella of the American College of, the American Lifestyle Medicine Board. They are going to educate or give half price exam entry to 1,400 doctors. That was the second thing that they offered. So as I say, maybe it was worth $1,500. So they're going to give them half price. It's not going to cost them for their half price. Who's paying the other half price? Are the doctors paying for that, or is the government paying for that? I've got no idea. But again, more money for the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. It's not costing them anything to gift people half price examination fees. And then the Adventist Health have just, I think it was October last year, said that they will, so Adventist Health is one of the big health institution groups that the Seventh Day Adventist Church own in America. They own 3, and it spreads out right across the whole of America with different groups owning different facilities, different universities, different hospitals and clinics and things. But Adventist Health is one of them. And the Adventist Health is on the West Coast, with Hawaii included in that space, so California and all down there. They said that they will partner with the American College of Lifestyle Medicine And the reason they want to partner with them, even though they're already probably involved with them, is that they've just recently bought the Blue Zone project. Now, I don't know, heard of the Blue Zones, Scott?
Of course.
Okay, if you think
Yeah.
about the Blue Zones, Giovanni Pes and Michel Pula were demographers back in the 1990s, European demographers, and they wanted to have a look at places, and I can also question and challenge some of their findings, and that there's more centenarians in other places. But let's just purely look at the fact that they did find some super centenarians and some very healthy people in Sardinia in the 1990s. And the reason they call it the Blue Zone is because when they highlighted this very tiny place with a blue highlighter pen, it turned blue. So that made it, well, this is a blue zone.
Wow. Okay. I never knew that. That's a very interesting little tidbit.
It is a little interesting tidbit. I think there's lots of interesting tidbits in history. I love it. So they looked particularly at the geography, at the culture, the demographers. They looked at all of the things that could potentially be contributing to the health and longevity of these people. They ended up naming 4 longevity zones, which they called the Blue Zones. It's Okinawa in Japan, Sardinia, Costa Rica, and in the Nicoya Peninsula, and one other one, which is going to escape my mind for a second. So there's 4. Each of these places are geographically isolated from industry, from place. These people were born and they grew up in these areas with a very strong culture, a community. They got lots of sleep, but not necessarily in Sardinia did they start early. They partied quite late and they slept in the mornings, but yes, they would have gotten their 8 hours. These communities raised livestock and or fished because they were so isolated. They had to provide all of their own foods, and every single one of them used lard for cooking. They didn't grow olive oil. They didn't grow olives for oil, and they didn't have the opportunity for seed oils. They used lard. It was the safest thing for them to use. So that means they ate pigs. They raised pigs. They had, I think, maybe not so much in Okinawa, but in the other spaces, they raised goats and sheep, and they had a lot of fermented milks, yogurts, cheeses. So what's the only blue zone that isn't geographically isolated, that people aren't necessarily born there and grow up there? They don't eat lard. They don't eat raw goat's milk or sheep's milk. It's a very, very different one. What's the only one that doesn't do that?
I could take a wild guess that it's Loma Linda.
Yes, you are correct. So Dan Buettner wanted to do a thing with National Geographic. And in 2004, he wanted to sell the longevity pill to Americans. But how can you do that if you've only got these places that are so far away? You have to find an American blue zone. And he decided on Loma Linda because admittedly, they do have some very healthy people and they do have some people who reach exceptional age. But it's not because they were born there and lived there their whole lives. It's not because they've never, they've grown up catching their own food all the time and doing all those other things. This is because 1/3 of the community belongs to the Seventh Day Adventist Church. They're devout Adventists that generally either come there to retire because they're already healthy, or they've come there to work. And the hospital and the university employ a lot of people in that town. So Dan Buettner thought, let's write a lifestyle for longevity, because I can't give you a pill, especially not from those diverse cultures. There's no pill we can put together. So, okay, let's look at they all got lots of sleep, not necessarily at the time that we would consider a good sleep, but they all got lots of sleep, maybe sleeps in the day too. Lots of sunlight, exercise. They needed to, a lot of them were living in mountainous areas. Certainly in Sardinia, they were shepherds. So we've got people who moved, sleep, had no processed industrial foods, not Loma Linda, because they often eat a lot of the church foods. I didn't say, but the church owns 20 plus food industries around the world where they create food to take the place of flesh, meat, milk, and butter. So they make cereals, soy, almond, oat milks. They make all the alternative meats, and they've been doing it since John Harvey Kellogg first invented these foods back in the late 1890s into the early 1900s. He owned 30 plus patents for the foods and processes he developed in his lifetime. And he was only 12 when he first started working for the first family of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. He was typesetting Ellen G. White's testimonies to the church. He was typesetting her books. And one book in particular was called A Solemn Appeal. I think another name was A Solemn Appeal to Mothers, but either way, it was directed at mothers. And the entire book was only discussing how to stop children from masturbating. It was talking about hard beds. It was talking, they developed cages to put over children's genitals so they couldn't touch their, so they couldn't touch themselves, and all sorts of terrible things. They thought children with epilepsy had epilepsy because they masturbated. And so it was quite horrific, some of these things. But he was only 12 when he was typesetting this original book. And meat was blamed for masturbating. And it caused everything from epilepsy to a decaying head. And it was as if you put a pistol to your heart and took your own life. I don't know, your children aren't 12 yet, but you imagine how impressionable a 12-year-old is reading all of this. And he did it for 4 years. That is it any wonder, after they paid for him to do medicine and employed him at their Battle Creek Sanitarium, or the Western Health Reform Institute, which he changed to Battle Creek Sanitarium, is it any wonder that his whole life was just spent trying to find replacements for meat, milk, eggs, and butter? That was his intent, because he believed they were so bad for people. And so come forward, now you've got the blue zones, and Dan Buettner's going, okay, well, yes, the Adventists eat a lot of fake food. If you look at the Adventist health studies and read the fine print, I jump around a lot, I'm so sorry, Scott, but read the fine print of the Adventist health studies. And to be a vegetarian, you can eat meat once a week. To be a vegan, in their interpretation, in the fine print, you can eat meat, or animal proteins and fats, less than once a month. So potentially the people who've moved to Loma Linda might not have been lifelong Seventh-day Adventists, but I'm not saying not all of them were, but a lot of them may not have been. Potentially they are still eating just enough animal proteins and fats to get their vitamin B12 if they've got a good store leading up to that. They potentially have done all of the things of those other communities. Sleep, they don't have alcohol, they don't smoke, they don't take drugs, so a lot of things, and they don't cheat, because their community, that would be a bad thing. In my community, if I say, oh, I won't have dessert, everyone's going, oh, have dessert, just a little bit, it's not going to hurt you. They don't do that in Loma Linda. So understanding that this blue zone area has been included, Adventist Health bought Dan Buettner's rights to the blue zone in 2020. So their plant slant diet that Dan Buettner's been putting out does not have anything to do with the other blue zones. They don't eat only plants. It's been manipulated. The data's been manipulated. The stories have been manipulated. If you go back and look at all of these things, the only one that does it is Loma Linda, and they have a plant slant diet. So because Adventist Health have bought this blue zones, now not only have they got these 3 health systems and all the hospitals and all the universities and everything else, or only one university, major one, there's a couple of other smaller ones, but they own health, a lot of the health in America. Now they've got the Blue Zone project. They're planning to run it right up the East Coast into Hawaii, I think 70 communities. In 2018, when I had a look, I found a document stating it was going to cost $6.7 million for a community to become Blue Zone accredited. Now, surely there's just a template, a bit like these resources that Adventists are offering to the doctors. There'd be a template. You might have to tweak it a little bit, but there couldn't be a lot of change from one community to the next community that would warrant $6.7 million, I don't believe, just in advising them how to become a Blue Zone community. They don't do the work. They get the communities to do the work. Anyway, that's beside the point. In 2021, the US Congress of Mayors which was 1,400 people as well. Each of these mayors have to have communities of at least 30,000 people to be part of this US Congress of Mayors. They adopted the blue zones for every one of their communities. They signed up and said, yes, we'll do it, owned by Adventist Health. And once this Congress passes a resolution, once this group of mayors passes the resolution, it goes to Congress and to the president, and it becomes official policy.
Wow.
So you've got the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and the blue zones. It's just...
That's crazy.
It is crazy. And there's no wonder that all these school programs are saying, don't eat meat. No, they're just demonizing animal proteins and fats. So I guess the scary thing, which we've been leading up to, and what I've discovered with Gary, he was eventually exonerated because I started a website and really peeved and just kept putting things out there. So it took another 2 years. But we've come to understand that these health and dietary guidelines have been shaped not only by the church, but definitely by vested interests, food, pharmaceutical, but big religion plays a big part in promoting a plant-based diet and demonizing animal proteins and fats. And it's really scary, Scott.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. We definitely have to get into a part 2 of this because there's so many different webs I want to get into. I really hope you'll grace us with the part 2.
I can grace you with the part 2.
Absolutely fantastic.